Hello everybody, it's Justin with Shock Therapy again, and we are here to show you how to install a Shock Therapy Level 4 spring kit on a Polaris XP Turbo with Fox internal bypass shock. This spring kit will eliminate rear bucking, it will plushion up the ride quality, allow the car to run flat and level through rough whoops. It will raise the ride height of your car as well as improve the overall ride quality from stock. If you're going to do just one thing to your car to improve the ride quality, then a spring kit is the first thing you should do. All of our springs are made in the USA and warranted for life. Over the first 1 to 200 miles, they will take a set one time, and after that, they will not settle again like the stock springs tend to do. Let's head over to the bench and take a look at what's included in this kit. So to my left on the workbench is a complete spring kit for this turbo. Included in the kit are 8 coil springs, which are marked on each coil spring as to where they go in the kit. Front upper, front lower, rear as well. Also, 8 crossover rings, 2 per shock that lock together, and O-rings to make this crossover silent when it engages a lower spring. One thing to remember is that these crossovers have a flat surface and they have a recessed surface. So when they're installed flat surface to flat surface, so they lock together, and the recessed surface facing the bottom, the O-ring actually fits in. We'll go over that again when this is installed on the shock. As always, it's a very good idea to lay out all the parts in advance so that you can make sure you have everything you need in the kit, and it gives you a good idea of how to install this on the car in advance. Remember that the rear shocks on this car are larger in diameter than the fronts, and that's reflected in the larger diameter crossover rings and larger diameter springs that go on the rear. Now, let's go ahead and start the installation. As always, we recommend safety glasses whenever installing any of our kits. Jack the car up until the tires are just barely off of the ground. Always use jack stands to make sure that the car is safe when it's jacked up. Remove the shock hardware starting with the lower bolt first. Save all of the stock hardware as you remove it from the car. Remember that the shocks are side specific. The reservoir is clocked closer to the firewall on each shock. Do not interchange the left and right sides as it will create a clearance problem between the reservoir and the upper arm. This is why we always do one side at a time so that we do not mismatch the shocks. Line up all of the components in advance for the complete kit. This helps you install it in the right order and make sure that all the parts are included that you need. Chris is grabbing the front springs, which are pre-marked as an upper and lower, as well as the crossover rings to install on this front shock. Using the spring compressor of your choice, remove the stock springs from the shock. It's easiest to lower the factory bump stop on the shock shaft so that you have the clearance to remove the lower spring perch. Make sure that you save the lower spring perch and the factory plastic spring divider, as they will be used in our new spring kit. With a screwdriver and a soft blow hammer, break the preload collars loose from each other. With the shock on the bench, it's time to set the preload and crossover heights. With the tape measure butted against the bottom of the bridge, measure to the bottom of the preload collar. 2 3/4 of an inch for preload and 5 3/4 of an inch for crossover. When installing the crossover, these rings have a flat surface and a recess groove surface. The flat surface should be touching each other. The recessed groove surface should be facing the top and bottom of the shock. This recessed groove is designed to hold the silent O-ring that installs on the bottom of the crossover. Threading the crossovers down the shock body takes some time, so make sure that you have them installed correctly the first time. Double checking the measurement for the crossover should be 5 3/4 of an inch to the bottom of the crossover. With the crossover rings located, you can install the silent O-ring. Before you install the spring kit, you can go ahead and lock down the preload collars in the determined position. This location is 2 3/4 of an inch. Make sure that you grab the spring that is marked upper front spring. Install the upper spring first. Install the factory spring divider with the long end facing the bottom of the shock. Next, install the lower spring, which is also marked front lower spring. Make sure that the upper and lower spring are clocked correctly where they touch the plastic divider. The ends of the springs should be touching the divider on the opposite sides of each other. 180 degrees apart. Compress the springs and install the lower spring perch. Make sure the perch lines up perfectly with the lower end of the shock as you remove tension of the springs. With the spring kit installed on the shock, you can now install the shock on the car. Start with the upper hardware first. If you decided to do both shocks at the same time, make sure that the shock is clocked accordingly with the reservoir facing the firewall. When installing the lower shock hardware, we found it very easy to use your toes to lift and lower the tire as you install the bolt. Leave all the hardware loose at this time so that we can adjust the ride height if needed at the end. Now you can remove the other side and repeat the process on the opposite side.
That chick's bad, dude.
With both shocks installed on the car and the hardware left loose, remove the jack stands and put the car back on the ground. Now you can start on the back of the car by jacking it up until the tires are off the ground. Always use jack stands to keep things safe while you have the car up in the air. Remove the factory plastics that cover the reservoir hose. Remove the reservoir from the frame tube. Remove the clutch intake tube from the upper fender intake. Remove the shock hardware starting with the lower bolt. Next, remove the upper bolt. Save all of the hardware. Remove the shock from the car. This can be done with one person feeding the reservoir through the hole in the bed, but this is much easier with two people if you have a friend that can help. Since the rear shocks are not side specific, we're going to go ahead and do both shocks at the same time. Repeat the removal steps on the opposite shock. As always, it's a good idea to lay out the components in advance of installing them. As always, the springs are marked upper and lower. You should have 2 upper springs, 2 lower springs, and 4 crossovers with 2 silent O-rings. Using your spring compressor, get ready to remove the stock springs. First, lower the factory bump stop on the shaft at least 2 inches to give you enough clearance to remove the lower spring perch. Compress the springs and remove the perch and rock guard. Release the pressure on the springs and remove the stock springs completely. Save the plastic spring divider. Break the preload collars loose and set them to 5 inches. This measurement is always taken from the bottom of the reservoir hose fitting to the bottom of the preload collars. Now install the supplied crossover rings. Just as in the front, the crossovers have a flat surface and a recessed groove. The flat surface is designed to touch each other where they lock together. The recessed groove should be facing the top of the shock on one crossover and the bottom of the shock on the other. This recessed groove is designed to hold the silent O-ring in place. Remember, a clean shock body will make installing these crossovers easy. With the tape measure butted against the bottom of the reservoir fitting, set the crossovers to 11 inches. This is always measured to the bottom of the crossover rings. With preload and crossover located according to our measurements, go ahead and lock them down with a hammer and screwdriver. Install the silent O-ring once the crossovers are located and locked. Install the upper spring first. Next, install the factory plastic spring divider with the long end facing the bottom of the shock. Install the lower spring. Make sure that the springs are clocked correctly with the ends of the springs touching the plastic divider on the opposite sides. This will keep the plastic divider as straight as possible when it's back on the car. Compress the springs and install the rock guard and lower spring perch. As you release tension, make sure that they are lined up perfectly with the lower loop of the shock. Repeat these steps on the other shock. You can now install the shocks on the rear of the car. Install the shock using the upper bolts first. Next, feed the reservoir through the passage in the bed and let it sit until the shock is installed completely. Install the lower hardware using your feet to raise and lower the tire, making the bolt easier to install. Make sure you leave the hardware loose so we can check ride height next. Make sure that you reinstall the clutch intake tube and the engine intake tube on the opposite side. Repeat the process on the opposite side. Remove the jack stands and lower the car back onto the ground. Now it's time to check ride heights. In order to do this, you must check ride heights with you in the car. You cannot just jump up and down on the car to settle the suspension. You must move the car back and forth, or at least drive it around the block, coming to a stop without hitting the brakes. All ride height measurements must be done with the driver in the car. When you measure the front ride height, always measure from the ground to the bottom of the frame at the lower control arm rear mount. With stock tires, the front ride height should be 14 inches. In the rear, measure from the ground to the skid plate right at the radius rod mounts. This measurement with stock tires should be 13.5 inches. Since every car is different, you might have to adjust the ride height according to your car specifically. If your car requires adjustments to get the ride heights we're asking for, the reason that we leave the hardware loose is so that you can take the shocks off the car and make adjustments. In the front, there's very little room to adjust the preload. We find it easier to remove the shocks, adjust the preload accordingly, and install the shock again, settling the car and measuring as many times as it takes to get the proper measurements.
Okay, you're good.
In the rear, there's adequate clearance to adjust the spring on the car. When adjusting ride height, you do not have to guess what the preload needs to be changed. The front of the car is a 2-to-1 ratio. Half of an inch of preload adjustment equals 1 inch of ride height. In the rear, it's almost 1-to-1. 1 inch of preload equals 1 inch of ride height. Once your ride heights are set, tighten all of the hardware, making sure not to forget the clutch intake and also the engine intake in the rear. If you forget these things, you'll wonder why you have no power when you take off with a pinched intake tube.
All right, good job.
With your ride height set and your hardware tightened, you are now done. It's time to go enjoy your new spring kit. If your ride heights were spot on, then you can tighten up all the hardware and install the reservoirs to the cage. So hopefully your installation went as easy as Chris made it look for us. Keep a few things in mind. Make sure that you settle the car by driving it. You cannot push up and down on the car and expect to get an accurate ride height measurement. Also, remember to check your ride heights after running the car 1 to 200 miles. The springs will take a set one time. After they do, adjust it once again and it should be good for the life of the car. Also, keep in mind, as you add accessories to the car, it's going to get heavier. People don't usually realize when they do it, it just creeps up on them. So you find yourself with a lower ride height, remember, you might have added a lot of weight to the car. Go ahead and adjust the ride height once again and you're good to go. Another thing that is great about running a spring kit on your car is that it's designed to work with our internal shock package as well. So if you want more ride quality than the spring kit gave you, or if you're looking for the ultimate comfort and handling, you can have your shocks brought back in. We'll do the internal work and complete the kit to a full stage 3 or 4 RIS. By combining the internal shock work that we offer with the spring kit that you have on your car, it's going to give you the best possible ride quality in all conditions. If you have any further questions about this spring kit or other products that we offer, go to our website at shocktherapist.com or call us at the shop at 623-217-4959.
DJ Tidwell on the crossover. Thank you.
Yep.
And my back hurts. Doctor says I need a bacchiotomy.
A bacchiotomy?
Yep. I don't know what that is, but heard it in a movie. What's up, ladies and gents?
Yes, I got you. I got you. Don't even confuse me. I'm still thinking about the car.
Perfect.
And I was like,
Justin took too many of his meds today.
hey, you know what it is? I had 2 donuts and a Mountain Dew.
Whoa.
Steve showed up with all of it at the Honda test.
You guys went a Honda testing again?
Yeah,
I saw
yeah.
it back in the
So you know what I was doing before filming this? Testing Hondas, which are rough.
Is that why you needed so many donuts?
Man, a couple donuts and a Mountain Dew. Bam!